Let's start by talking through some of the broad ideas behind Module 1. And when we've done this, I'll introduce the essay questions to you. We can broadly say that as the 20th century drew to a close, the overwhelming population question was how could we stop the world population from growing to over 20 billion across the next century? But within a couple of decades, demographic projections have shifted away from rampant growth to declining and ageing populations. So the new defining demographic characteristics of the 21st century are likely to be declining births and stabilisation in size, with maximum world population predicted to increase from the current 7 to around 11 billion. We can look at this in different parts of the world. The emerging economies are going to grow. Asia, Latin America and the least developed countries, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, are going to account for 97% of the growth up to the middle of the century. Asia will comprise over half the world's population by 2050 at 5 billion, and alternatively, Europe is going to decline from currently around 740 to about 709 million. The age composition of the population is going to alter, the median ages are going to rise, and there's going to be a proportionate shift from younger to older people, and this is going to occur almost across the entire globe. So in Module 1, we're going to ask, how did we get here? Now, the answer lies in the interaction of three main demographic drivers: fertility or childbearing rates, mortality or death rates, and patterns of migration. Let's look at the three different zones in the world: the advanced economies, the emerging economies, and the least developed world, and see how these demographic trends are going to alter their societies and economies. So advanced economies, they're going to be affected by three dominant trends: a fertility rate which is going to be below replacement level, unprecedented and continued declines in particularly late life mortality, and a relatively high level of inward migration. And the kind of societies that are going to emerge from that are going to be framed with factors such as a decline in the proportion of younger people, an increase in the proportion and number of older people, and a far more ethnically diverse composition. Alternatively, these emerging economies, they're going to be affected by rapidly falling total fertility levels, which are going to be particularly low among urban and affluent women, but will still be high among rural and poor women. They will have increasing life expectancies, though often these are going to be without the institutional structures to support the resulting growing number of elderly dependents. And they're going to have to cope with high rural to urban migration and the potential outmigration of skilled workers. So the kind of societies we're going to see in these parts of the world are going to be societies with a decline in the proportion of children, an increase in the demographic dividend, or the percentage of population of working or productive age, and a small but growing increase in the proportion and number of older people. In contrast, the least developed economies are going to be affected by still very high total fertility levels, especially among the rural and poor women, which are beginning to fall, though are also experiencing some stalling, a limited reduction in infant and maternal mortality rates, and high rural to urban migration. And as a consequence, these population changes are going to frame societies that will have still, at least till the middle of the century, a very high proportion of child dependence and of young adults, which may or may not become a demographic dividend. They may become a youth bulge, which could arise to a conflict, for example. And they're also going to experience the rapid urbanization of their countries and the need for education to develop their own skilled labour. How has this come about? This, in fact, is nothing new. For many years, demographers have been aware of something called the demographic transition. And you can see here in this graph how the demographic transition is playing out. Here we have the beginning of the demographic transition when mortality and fertility rates are still high. Think of England in about 1780 and current Niger, for example. What then begins to happen as we go into the second stage of the transition, is that mortality rates begin to fall, particularly infant mortality. And in response, women start to having fewer children. The example we might want to think there is England in the early 19th century and current day Ethiopia, for example. In the third stage, in response to this, fertility starts to come down. But look at this rapid increase in population that you can experience, which is what England was experiencing throughout the 19th century, and countries like Sri Lanka, for example, are experiencing at the moment. And finally, we head into the last stage of the demographic transition, low fertility, low mortality, and that's the kind of demographies we have in most of our advanced economies. Now, of course, it took 150 years for most European countries to go through the demographic transition from predominantly young to predominantly older societies. But many of the emerging economies in particular are going to go through this transition in 25 years. And this is what's going to put such challenges on their economies and societies and raise questions around how are they going to cope with the demographic dividend or youth bulge that's going to go through their population. Are they going to be able to capitalize on it so we have productivity, or is it going to be social unrest as high levels of youth unemployment, for example? And then how are they going to put in place those kind of structures we need for older dependents, pensions and long-term care? So Module 1 itself is going to take you through some of these ideas through 3 questions. One question is going to look at issues around fertility. One question is going to look at issues around falling mortality. And the third one is going to look at the impact of migration.